because a lot of food poisoning can be from viral causes. Norovirus is the most common cause of like food poisoning, basically. And that is, we're not sure, but it's not as closely linked. So it's more when there's a bacterial cause of food poisoning. So, so just because you get food poisoning doesn't mean you're definitely going to go on to get this. But the way it occurs is actually through an autoimmune process. And what happens are the toxins that these pathogenic bacteria release. Well, one of them in particular, called cytolethal distending toxin, CDTB for short, it looks very similar to a protein on one of our small intestine nerve cells. We have these cells all throughout the small intestine. And so through a case of mistaken identity, or basically cross-reactivity, because they look similar, the immune system will target that cell, that protein on that cell, at the same time that it's targeting the toxin. And this will go on. It has to get shut off somehow. And the problem with autoimmunity is that that mechanism isn't being shut off. And so what will happen is, over time, it might not happen right away. You might have had the food poisoning, recovered from that, be okay. But over time, the immune system is destroying these cells, and these cells are responsible to make that migrating motor complex happen. And so then over time, less of those cells are there. They can't really do the motion. And it might be 3 months later. It could even be 6 months later, which is really confusing to link back. Why would you think, oh, well, the food poisoning I had 6 months ago when I was on vacation somewhere, maybe is why I now, I'm having bloating or constipation, pain, whatever. So that's one of the main ways it happens, is through an autoimmune self-damage. Now, there's plenty others, but before I go on, just want to know if you had any comments on that.
No, that's brilliant. I think one question that might not be the best time to ask, but just in case I forget it later on, with motility, am I right in saying that we have kind of different, what's the best way to say it? We have different sort of rates of motility within different parts of the intestine.
Yes, this is one of the key things I love to teach. It's true, each organ has its own separate motility, because the organs, while they're all connected and all part of the same system, they are distinct. Like I think of them like rooms maybe in a house, like with a front and a back door, like, a door that leads from one to the other. And you can close those doors and you can do all sorts of things in that room that you're not doing in the next room, like a kitchen versus a bathroom, versus the living room. Right. So they're very distinct. So the stomach has its own motility. The small intestine has its own motility with the migrating motor complex. And then the large intestine has giant migrating motions. It's different than the migrating motor complex. The migrating motor complex does not move through the small intestine, through the large intestine, and give someone a bowel movement. That is not the same thing. The bowel movement comes from a different motion that's generated in the large intestine. These are not connected. In fact, the migrating motor complex, many of them, the actual, we have a movement about migrating motor complex movement about every 90 minutes, if everything's healthy. Not all of them even reach the full end of the small intestine. So they're not causing a bowel movement. That's very important for people with diarrhea to know, that we are interested in increasing motility in the small intestine, and that's not necessarily going to give you a bowel movement. In fact, the number one physiologic underlying cause of SIBO is deficient migrating motor complex, or motility, we could say, in the small intestine, even for those with diarrhea. So the predominant amount of people who have SIBO with diarrhea have slow small intestine motility. They got a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine that's leading to diarrhea in the large intestine. So very, very important point. Yeah. And one other example I always like to mention is gastroparesis, which is slow stomach emptying. You can have slow stomach emptying where the food is not moving down. You can feel the food sitting there. Sometimes the food actually regurgitates. It's not like vomiting. It just sort of comes back to the throat a little. And you're nauseous and have diarrhea. So you can have super stuck motility in the stomach and have diarrhea in the large intestine. That's how it goes.
Yeah. And I think we often customers get a little bit confused with that to some degree when they think, I can't have compromised motility because I have diarrhea. So I think there's obviously just a assumption that things are moving through all of the intestine too quickly, but you've done a great job of breaking that down. Yes.
And why wouldn't someone think that? You truly have to have medical training. And honestly, most medical doctors do not get that training that I just shared with you. So look, you're ahead of everybody right now. So back to the causes of slow motility. Other things that can do it would be, for instance, like hypothyroidism. Hashimoto's hypothyroidism is the most common form of hypothyroidism. Very, very common. And we don't know all the reasons why slow thyroid or, deficient thyroid leads to slow motility. There are actually 7 mechanism of actions that are proposed, 7 theories, and I don't have them all memorized, but there's very different physiological things. But we do know when someone has hyperthyroid, they tend to have diarrhea. When they have hypothyroid, they tend to have constipation. The thyroid affects all the organs, actually, not just the small intestine, but also the large intestine. And then something like diabetes could cause slow motility. And this is because, well, first of all, it can cause gastroparesis. That's the slow stomach empty. This is through vagal nerve damage. The vagus nerve helps a lot in the motility, regulating the motility of the digestive organs. And in diabetes, glucose is getting into cells that don't have a gatekeeper, and nerves are one of those cell types. So they can be damaged by the excessive glucose. So that's another reason. So another disease would be Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This is gaining a lot of awareness in recent times. It was thought to be a rare disease, but isn't. It's actually not a rare disease at all. It's actually quite common. And it's a hypermobility sort of disease where people are quite flexible in their joints, like, their fingers and things. And this flexibility leads to lax tissues, and like prolapses of loops of the intestines can occur because the connective tissue is very, very loose and flexible, and it can't do the proper, contractions. And so that can lead to slow motility in diseases like that. There's also medicines that can cause it. So one of them would be opiate narcotic painkillers. These are very commonly used, surgeries, back pain, all sorts of, you get your wisdom teeth pulled. People are often on opiates for various reasons. Sometimes they have reasons they're on opiate painkillers that they can't get off. They have certain conditions that really require it. And that's a real risk factor for SIBO. Most people know that when they go on one of those types of medicines, they get constipated. Again, like the thyroid, this is one of those ones that affects both the small and the large intestine. So it slows motility through its action on nerves in the small intestine as well. And so again, it stops that migrating motor complex, and then bacteria can overgrow. There are lots of other ones, like, for instance, I won't go into the mechanisms of them all, but Lyme disease can cause slow motility. Traumatic brain injury, which is actually, there's really an epidemic of traumatic brain injury. People don't think there is, because they think, oh, I'm not in a coma, I haven't been playing football my whole life or whatever. But traumatic, I'll let you all look into it later. It's widespread. That slows motility. Parkinson's disease, systemic sclerosis, also called scleroderma. So many other causes of slow motility. Let me just think if I can think of any other ones. Well, that's probably enough right now. There's just so many. So I guess one of the things to think about from that is the fact that even just the food poisoning that I mentioned is really enough. Food poisoning, who hasn't had food poisoning? Now, understandably, viral food poisoning is more common. However, think about how many people have had multiple occasions of food poisoning, most everybody. And so just thinking of that, a good percentage of those will turn into SIBO. That might explain how common SIBO is in and of itself. But then you add in all these other things I just mentioned. Think about how common hypothyroidism is, et cetera, opiate narcotics. And, another one I didn't mention was antibiotics. There's a pilot study that showed antibiotics slow the motility in the stomach. I mean, everybody's taking antibiotics. So for goodness sakes, it really helps explain how common SIBO, because SIBO is basically IBS. Most of IBS is SIBO. It explains how common it is. So many common causes.
And is there any research on just the role that stress can play from a motility perspective?
Yeah, stress can turn off the migrating motor complex. So here we're talking about like sympathetic dominance. If we just think about sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic is, running away from the tiger, fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. So the parasympathetic state is when we have our migrating motor complex, when we can be digesting our food, we have hydrochloric acid secretion, enzyme secretion, etc. So they did a study, and they looked they stressed people in a laboratory in various different ways. One of them was actually quite funny. I just want to mention they had them overnight and had them sleep, but they would wake them up at intervals with loud, blaring heavy metal music and bright lights. Like,
Wow.
it's just, like, you just think about these experiments, they're kind of funny, actually. And guess what they found? That the migrating motor complex was turned off in stressful situations. So the sympathetic system will turn it off. And the reason why is because those two sort of oppose each other. It's like, you know, when you're running away from the tiger, so to speak, you don't need to be digesting. It's more important that you run away from the tiger. So it's important. Being in a parasympathetic state and not in a constant state of stress is very important for our motility. Now, I will tell you that I have only ever seen one case in, you know, my 10 years or however long it's been, where I could definitely tell that stress was the cause of that person's SIBO. It was very clear, but in all other cases, I think it's more of a risk factor piling on top of already other things that are there. Like, you know, they have food poisoning, or they have this disease, or they have that. Stress just made it worse, or maybe made the tipping point come faster. So, so that's the truth of my clinical experience, but there's also something else here. Originally, IBS was said to be just like in people's heads and caused by stress. And we now have all of these pathophysiological mechanisms identified. And so we just don't want to go backward and be like, well, it's just because you're stressed. You know what I mean? So, but yes, stress absolutely plays into it. Absolutely. And we all must do stress management in our modern world. We all must.
Yeah. I definitely think I've seen clinically the role that stress can play in sort of inhibiting progress as well. So when you put the program together, or it's contributing to a flare up, that's where I think it really comes into its own, the stress elements.
Absolutely, I agree. Absolutely.
Okay. So with all of that in mind,
there was another question you asked me in the beginning. You wanted to know the causes of slow motility, and then maybe was it something about the prokinetics or something? I'm not sure. I'll let you lead.
Yeah, I think it would have been. So I think my plan was for us to go into sort of the underlying causes, talk about motility, and then obviously talk about, well, what are some of the strategies and the solutions that we have to support motility if it is compromised. So that kind of leads us into prokinetics, I guess.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure I answered your question. So prokinetics are just this wonderful category of medicines that I was not taught a thing about when I was in medical school, but I had to learn about them by treating SIBO, because Dr. Pimentel, who's our lead researcher in SIBO, he had created an algorithm years ago for treating IBS with SIBO, and he had prokinetics in there, and he'd done a study on them as well, and really found that what they did was extend remission periods. So basically, the main thrust treatment for SIBO is to attack the bacterial overgrowth head on with some kind of antibacterials. There's all different ways we can approach that. And once that is completed, and the bacteria is eradicated, there's a high chance of relapse. The reason for that, just briefly, would be primarily because of the underlying cause. The SIBO is always caused by something. And I just mentioned all these things. Well, diabetes, we don't have a cure for. I'm just using that as an example. The food poisoning that causes this autoimmunity, we don't have a cure for. And so if we don't know how to eliminate these diseases, these causes of SIBO, well, then the SIBO can just return. That would be sort of the primary reason why SIBO might relapse so frequently. So what he was trying to do was come up with a strategy to extend the remission period and make it so people don't relapse as frequently if you cannot get rid of the underlying cause. Now, just one little thing I want to say is all of what I'm just saying here requires thought about the underlying cause, and it's really, really important to have a practitioner that is looking and trying to identify what the underlying cause is, because what if it is something that can be gotten rid of? And one other thing is, just because an underlying cause can't be gotten rid of